I didn't make a sound. That was the thing nobody understood. People expected me to cry, to grab the edge of the mahogany table and demand someone explain what was happening. But I sat there in that lawyer's office in Baton Rouge with my hands folded in my lap, and I did not make a single sound. My brother-in-law, my husband's younger brother, a man I had known for 41 years, leaned back in his chair across the table from me and smiled. Not a polite smile. The kind of smile a man gives when he already knows how the game ends. Then he looked at Mr. Mile, Beaumont, the estate attorney, and said, "Go ahead, read the rest." I thought about my husband in that moment. Franklin. I thought about the way he used to hum when he made his coffee in the morning, always slightly off-key, always the same 3 bars of an old Nat King Cole song he could never quite remember the words to. I thought about how he smelled like cedar and motor oil, even on his best-dressed days. I thought about 43 years of that man, and I held on to it like ballast. Because if I let go of it for even 1 second, I was going to flip that table. My name is Harriet. I am 67 years old. I was born in Shreveport, Louisiana, raised by a schoolteacher mother and a father who drove trucks for 40 years without a single accident. I am not a woman who falls apart easily, but I want to be honest with you. That afternoon in that office, I came closer to falling apart than I ever have in my life. Let me go back to the beginning. Franklin and I met when I was 24. He was 27, working as an electrical engineer, quiet and careful and deliberate in everything he did. We got married in a small church in Metairie on a Saturday in October. His brother, Walter, was the best man. I remember thinking Walter was charming that day, full of easy jokes and warm handshakes. I thought, this is a good family I'm marrying into. I had no idea what kind of man Walter would eventually become. Or maybe I did, and I told myself it didn't matter, because Franklin and I had our own life. Franklin was brilliant with money, not in a showy way. We never drove fancy cars or took extravagant vacations. But he was disciplined. He invested early, made careful decisions, and over the course of a long career, we built something real. Our home in Covington, paid off by the time he was 55, rental properties in Slidell that generated steady income, a portfolio that had grown considerably by the time he retired. When our financial advisor sat us down 2 years before Franklin got sick, she told us we were in a very strong position, comfortable, secure, the kind of security my father had always wanted for me and never quite managed to get for himself. We had 1 daughter, Rosalind. She lived in Atlanta, worked as a physical therapist, had 2 kids and a husband I genuinely liked. Franklin adored her. She was the thing he was most proud of in the world, and that's saying something, because he was proud of a lot. When the diagnosis came, early onset Alzheimer's, which at 69 felt like a cruel joke, given how sharp Franklin had always been, we were devastated, both of us, but Franklin was determined to get his affairs in order while he still could, and that was just who he was. He updated his will. He met with the attorney. He told me clearly what he wanted: the house to me, the rental properties, split between me and Rosalind, the portfolio to remain in a trust for both of us, managed by our long-time financial advisor. He told me he'd taken care of everything. I believed him. What I did not know was that Walter had started visiting Franklin during the months when I was taking my mother to her chemo appointments in New Orleans. 3 times a week I drove down there and back. Franklin insisted I not skip those trips. He said Mama needed me more than he did right then. He said he was fine, the home nurse was there, everything was under control. What I did not know was that Walter used those hours to get close to Franklin again, to reminisce, to present himself as the devoted younger brother who had been kept away by distance and circumstances, to make himself necessary, and to introduce Franklin to a new attorney. I found out about the second will, the way you find out about most devastating things in life. Too late and all at once. Franklin passed in March. Peaceful, the hospice nurse told me. He went in his sleep on a Tuesday morning while I was downstairs making oatmeal. By the time I climbed the stairs, he was already gone. I stood in the doorway of our bedroom for a long time before I walked over and sat on the edge of the bed and held his hand. I am not going to describe those weeks to you. Some things are private. What I will say is that grief does something strange to time. Some hours lasted days. Some days disappeared entirely. Rosalind flew in from Atlanta and stayed for 3 weeks, and I don't know what I would have done without her. It was 6 weeks after the funeral that Mr. Beaumont called me to come in for the reading of the will. I dressed carefully that morning. Cream blouse, charcoal slacks, the pearl earrings Franklin gave me on our 30th anniversary. I don't know why it felt important to look composed. It just did. Rosalind drove me. We walked into that office together, and Walter was already there, sitting on the right side of the table with a woman I didn't recognize, a younger woman in a dark blazer, with the careful blank expression of someone who has been well paid to look neutral. I looked at Walter. He nodded at me. Cordial. The way you nod at a stranger in an elevator. Mr. Beaumont opened a folder. He cleared his throat, and he began to read. The will he read was not the will Franklin had described to me. In this document, dated 8 months before Franklin died. During those months I was driving to New Orleans. The rental properties went entirely to Walter. The investment portfolio, aside from a modest amount set aside for Rosalind, was to be liquidated and distributed in a manner that I can only describe as designed to benefit Walter's involvement in a real estate venture that he and Franklin had apparently agreed to fund together. The house remained mine, but nearly everything Franklin had spent 40 years building, the financial legacy he had been so careful and deliberate about, had been redirected. Mr. Beaumont finished reading. The office was very quiet. Walter leaned back in his chair and smiled. "Go ahead," he said. "Read the rest." There was a codicil, a small handwritten edition, initialed by Franklin. It stated that any disputes regarding the estate were to be settled through private arbitration rather than the courts, and that arbitration proceedings could only be initiated by the named beneficiaries. Walter was a named beneficiary. I was not. I looked at Walter's hands resting flat on the table. I looked at the woman in the dark blazer. I looked at Mr. Beaumont, who had handled our estate planning for 19 years, and who could not quite meet my eyes. I said, "I'd like a copy of every document in that folder." Walter said, "Of course, Harriet. We expected you'd want that." He said we. I picked up my purse. I said to Rosalind, "Let's go." I did not look at Walter again as I walked out of that office. Rosalind held my arm in the elevator. She didn't say anything. Neither did I. We got into the car, and I sat in the passenger seat, and I watched the parking garage wall in front of us, and I thought very clearly Franklin did not write that will. There are things a woman knows after 43 years with a man. I knew his handwriting. Those initials on the codicil were close, but not right. The loop on the capital F was wrong. Franklin always closed his loops completely. These initials did not. I knew his language. Franklin was an engineer. He was precise. He did not use vague phrases like financial interests as mutually understood. He wrote exactly what he meant, always. I knew his values. Franklin had spoken to me, clearly, coherently, less than 14 months before he died, about what he wanted for Rosalind. He would not have reduced her inheritance to a token amount. He would not have done it. It was not in him. And I knew Walter. I had watched Walter for 41 years. I had watched him borrow money from Franklin 3 times and repay it twice. I had watched him show up at holidays when he needed something and disappear when he didn't. I had watched Franklin make excuses for him, the way older siblings often do, the way love sometimes blinds a person. I had watched, and I had said very little, because that was Franklin's brother, and it was not my place. But now Franklin was gone, and it was absolutely my place. I did not call a family lawyer. I called a friend from church, a woman named Octavia, whose son was a forensic document examiner working in Dallas. I called him the next morning. He was professional and careful with me. He explained what he could assess and what he couldn't. He told me what to look for, what to preserve, and what questions to ask. Then I called a probate litigation attorney in New Orleans, a woman named Ingrid, who had been recommended to me by my financial advisor. She had short grey hair and a voice like gravel, and she had been practicing probate litigation for 31 years. When I sat across from her desk and laid out what I knew, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Tell me about the month your husband was in home care." I told her everything, the schedule, the home nurse's name, the days I was in New Orleans. I told her about Walter's visits. I told her about the new attorney, whose name appeared on the revised will, a man named Foster, whose practice I had never heard of, and who was not, as far as I could tell, affiliated with any firm of any real standing in Louisiana. Ingrid took notes. When I finished, she looked at her notepad and said, "You said your husband had early Alzheimer's when this document was signed." "Yes." "Do you have medical records from that period?" "I have everything." She looked at me then, directly. She said, "I want to tell you something. This may take time. It will almost certainly be expensive, and there are no guarantees. Do you understand that?" "I understand." "Then let's get started." What followed was 7 months I do not wish to repeat. The forensic examination of the documents, the deposition of the home nurse, a gentlewoman from Gretna who had kept meticulous daily notes as part of her professional practice, notes that documented Franklin's cognitive state on specific dates, including the date that second will was signed, the testimony of Franklin's neurologist, the discovery that the attorney, Foster, had a prior disciplinary complaint filed against him in 2019 for unduly influencing a client during estate planning, a complaint that had been settled quietly and that Walter almost certainly knew about, which was presumably the reason he'd chosen the man. There was a morning, about 4 months into this process, when Ingrid called me and said, "I need you to sit down." I was already sitting, but I held the phone tighter. She said, "We found a discrepancy in the notarization dates." She explained it carefully. The document had been notarized on a date that, according to the home nurse's notes and Franklin's medical records, was a day when his cognition was severely compromised. His neurologist had documented it as one of his worst days, a day when Franklin had not recognized the home nurse who had been caring for him for months, a day when he'd believed he was late for a work meeting that he had not had in 4 years, a day when he was not, by any legal standard, competent to execute a legal document, and yet his signature appeared on a will dated that day. "Can you prove it?" I asked. "I believe we can make a very compelling case," she said, "and I believe, when confronted with that case, that certain parties may find it in their interest to reach a settlement rather than go to court." She was right. I will not describe in detail what happened in the mediation room 3 months later, because some of what was agreed to is confidential, and some of it is still too raw for me to revisit comfortably. What I will tell you is that Walter did not look at me during the entire proceeding. Not once. He looked at his attorney, he looked at the table, he looked at his hands. He had walked into that lawyer's office 6 months ago with the easy confidence of a man who believed he had already won. He walked out of that mediation looking older, smaller, like something had been taken from him. Something had. The rental properties were restored to the estate as Franklin had originally intended. The portfolio, which Walter had already begun to move, was subject to a clawback and restoration agreement. A portion of what had been drained was gone. Legal fees, some of Walter's maneuvers, but the core of what Franklin had built for Rosalind and for me was recovered. Foster, the attorney, surrendered his license. I was told that quietly by Ingrid over the phone. She didn't editorialize, neither did I. The Sunday after everything was settled, I went to the cemetery. I brought Franklin his favorite thing, a cup of coffee in a travel mug, dark roast, no sugar, and I sat on the little bench near his marker, and I told him what had happened. All of it. I talked for a long time. The cemetery was quiet. A mockingbird landed on a headstone nearby and watched me for a while. I told him I was sorry I hadn't been there those days when Walter came. I told him I wished he had been able to tell me. I told him I knew he would have, if he could have. And then I told him what Rosalind had said to me the night before, when I'd called to tell her the final outcome. She'd been quiet for a moment, and then she'd said, "Mama, Daddy chose the right woman." I sat with that for a long time. I don't know that I am a particularly brave person. I don't know that I am especially clever or strong. I am a woman who drove to New Orleans 3 times a week, so my mother didn't have to face chemotherapy alone. I am a woman who came home to an empty house and made oatmeal and climbed the stairs. I am a woman who sat in a lawyer's office and watched a man smile and said nothing, because I already knew that the moment to say something was not then. The moment came later, and I was ready for it. I think about Walter sometimes. I think about what he told himself to make what he did feel acceptable. I think maybe he told himself Franklin owed him something. I think maybe he told himself I wouldn't fight, that I was too old, too tired, too deep in grief to dig in and push back. I think he believed that grief makes people small. He was wrong about that. Grief, when you let it, can make you very precise. It can strip away everything that is not essential and leave you with just the thing that matters most. What mattered most to me was Rosalind. What mattered most to me was what Franklin had worked for. What mattered most to me was telling the truth about what happened to him. I did that. I told the truth. The coffee had gone cold before I finally got up from that bench. I set the travel mug against the base of the marker. Franklin would have rolled his eyes at the waste, but I left it there anyway. I straightened my coat. I walked back to my car in the quiet morning, and the mockingbird followed me for a little while, before it found something more interesting. I drove home. I unlocked my front door. I walked into the kitchen, and I made myself a fresh cup of coffee, and I sat at the table in the house that Franklin built, in the morning light, and I thought, I hope I made you proud, old man. I believe I did. I have thought a lot about what Walter believed when he walked into that mediation room. I think he believed that time was on his side, that I was 67 years old and tired and still raw from losing Franklin, and that those things would add up to someone who simply wouldn't have the energy to fight. He had watched me at the will, reading, quiet, hands folded, no tears, and I think he mistook stillness for surrender. A lot of people make that mistake about older women. We have learned over a lifetime that the loudest response is rarely the most effective one. Silence is not weakness. Sometimes silence is just a woman deciding when to move. What Walter did required three things to work. He needed Franklin to be vulnerable, he needed me to be distracted, and he needed the paperwork to hold. He got the first two. He miscalculated on the third. And that is the thing about plans built on deception. They require everything to go right. The truth only needs one crack. The crack was a date on a notarization. One day. One set of medical notes written by a home nurse who had no idea, when she wrote them, that they would one day matter so much. Franklin's neurologist documenting a bad day the way doctors do, carefully, thoroughly, without knowing the record would eventually end up in a lawyer's hands. None of those people were trying to protect me. They were just doing their jobs honestly, and honest work has a way of outlasting dishonest schemes, even years later, even when nobody planned it that way. I think about the choices Walter made, and I don't feel hatred toward him anymore. What I feel is something closer to pity, and I want to be honest that the pity took a long time to arrive. For months I felt something sharp and hot every time his name came into my mind. That's fair. What he did was a serious wrong, but at some point I had to decide whether I was going to carry that sharpness with me forever, and I decided I wasn't. Not because he deserved to be let off the hook in my heart, but because I deserved to put the weight down. What I keep coming back to is Rosalind. She called me the night the settlement was finalized, and she said, "Mama, Daddy chose the right woman." I have turned that sentence over in my hands many times since then. I know what she meant, that Franklin chose well when he chose me, but I also think there's something in it about choosing yourself, about deciding, even in grief, even at 67, even when someone has handed you what they assumed would be the final word, deciding that you are not finished, that you still have the capacity to think clearly, to act deliberately, to see something through. That is not a young person's instinct, it is something you earn. And I am grateful in a way I couldn't have anticipated, for every hard year that taught me how to be still when stillness was called for, and how to move when moving was what was needed. Franklin built something over 40 years because he showed up every single day and made careful choices. I protected it for the same reason. The values were already in the house. I just had to be willing to defend them.